Thank you very much, Ignace. And let me first thank RB Rail for organizing this forum. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Rail Baltica is one of the 5 major projects of the Trans-European Transport Network and of its funding instrument, the Connecting Europe Facility. It is indeed both a cross-border and missing link of the North Sea Baltic corridor, essential for the well-functioning of this corridor from Warsaw to Tallinn. But Rail Baltica is also widely recognized as a project of geostrategic importance, which will definitely link, by high-speed rail, the Baltic states with the rest of the European Union. It is therefore very relevant to speak of military mobility when speaking of Rail Baltica as a project with both a transport and defense dimension. All the more relevant as defense is also a new dimension of the TEN-T. Military mobility is indeed one of the major initiatives of the transport infrastructure policy and of the EU defense policy in the past years. Since President Juncker's State of the Union address in September 2017, where he expressed the imperative to create a fully fledged Europe Defense Union by 2025, military mobility has been moving at a high pace and tangible progress has been achieved. It is based on the assumption that an EU defense policy can be more quickly developed and strengthened if it builds up on EU civilian policies. Why do we need to act in military mobility? As regards infrastructure policy, because parts of the EU infrastructure are unsuitable for movement and transport of military forces, but also because military needs should be taken into account when the EU spends billions on infrastructure development. In March 2018, the Commission and the European External Action Service adopted a joint action plan on military mobility. The first delivery of this action plan were the military requirements adopted in November 2018 by the Defense Council. They include military technical standards of transport infrastructure, where NATO input was essential, and the identification of the geographical military network within the EU. Rail Baltica is, of course, part of this military network. The second delivery is being finalized and should be published in April 2019. It identifies the gaps between the military requirements and the EU civilian TEN-T legislation. 2 preliminary conclusions can be drawn from the work already done. The gaps, in terms of technical standards, are regarded to be possible to bridge through mitigating measures. This means that an infrastructure can be regarded as being useful for military purposes, even if some military technical standards are not met, by putting in place mitigating measures. It concerns especially rail, and therefore Rail Baltica. The military network, as decided by the Defense Council, matches the TEN-T network by 94%. It means that 94% of the military network is included in our TEN-T network. The conclusions of the gap analysis will feed into the next deliverable, being the definition of the dual-use infrastructure requirements to be presented around the summer of 2019. They represent the standards up to which the self-contribution will be granted in the coming 2021-2027 multi-financial framework. They also represent the part of the gap between military and civilian standards which is still useful in civilian terms. At this point in time, it should be mentioned that the European military staff, in collaboration with NATO, plans to lower some of the military standards, especially for rail, following the work done in the gap analysis. These new standards should be adopted by the Council in June or July. This should lead the new military standards to be very close to those foreseen for Rail Baltica, which would mean that, as regards Rail Baltica, the dual use would be quite close to the civilian standards. Most of Rail Baltica could therefore be eligible to both the CEF normal envelope and the CEF military envelope. As regards this CEF military envelope, you know that the Commission has proposed 6.5 billion euros for the 2021-2027 multi-financial framework. And we hope that this MFF could be adopted in the autumn 2019. The new CEF regulation itself is now agreed by the co-legislators, including the parts related to military mobility. They will allow co-funding at 50% of both upgrades of existing transport infrastructure as well as new infrastructure. Cohesion member states, such as those concerned by Rail Baltica, will have the possibility to transfer part of their cohesion fund allocation to top up the military mobility contribution up to 85% co-funding. Ladies and gentlemen, the new CEF provisions on military mobility create a win-win situation for both transport and defense. They allow for the first time in the EU a major contribution to military mobility. They also allow to complete more quickly the TEN-T network through an increase of the available funds, the co-funding of transport modes, especially road and air, or parts of the TEN-T network, especially the comprehensive network, which the CEF was poorly addressing until now, and also the co-funding of higher infrastructure standards, still useful for civilian needs. Thank you very much for your attention.